Hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Wong, and this is Hibiku Kotoba, a podcast series from J-Sei, where I talk with AANHPI creatives, leaders, innovators, and more about their personal journeys, their work, and insights. Today, I'm joined with Kelly Goto, a global lecturer and educator in the UX design and research communities, founder of gotomedia and gotoresearch, and has recently published a book titled Seattle Samurai, a tribute to her father Sam Goto and his illustrative works of the comic strip Seattle Tomodachi. Seattle Tomodachi was published in the North American Post for 5 years and celebrates the immigrant journey and Seattle's Japanese American heritage while striving for the American dream. Seattle Samurai is nominated for a 2025 Will Eisner Award for Best Graphic Reprint. Kelly is a J-Sei who resides in Seattle, Washington, and is continuing to encourage tech with culture and to continue sharing the importance of cultural preservation and storytelling through generations. Kelly, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so happy to have you here on Hibiku Kotoba.
Kathleen, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
I'm also excited to talk about your newest book later in the episode as well. But first, I'd like to talk about your journey on choosing UX design and research. But before we take a brief deep dive, would you mind briefly sharing or defining what that is to the listeners who are unfamiliar with UX design and research?
Yeah, so UX stands for user experience, and it's really come about in the last, 2 decades. And it is about how humans interact with digital devices and websites and apps. And it's really putting human centric design into the center. So the work I do thinks not just of what it is that someone's trying to do, but how it incorporates into their life and how it can be improved in a way to make their life better.
And you have such a storied history in the tech industry. You've published books about the UX design, one in 2001, and then a new edition in 2005, which became a primer for user experience, and it's still used as a curriculum even today around the world. And on your website, there's a visual timeline of your business cards, which is so cool. It's so easy to break down as well. And your first business card was Kelly Goto calligraphy, and then it gradually evolves, and there's an addition of photography, graphic design, then producer, freelancer, creative director for companies like Toyota and Warner Brothers, and all that to say, it's led your career path to found your own companies. From calligraphy to graphic design to UX, why did you choose UX design and research? Was it a natural decision?
Well, I think I want to start a little bit at the beginning in that I think it's important, even as kids in elementary school, that we gravitate towards things that we love doing. So I was always interested in lettering
Mm.
and taught myself calligraphy and used it to generate the first clients that I had in fifth grade. And really, when I created that first business card in sixth grade, I did it as an affirmation. So my parents taught me very early on that it is important to clearly state in the present tense what it is that you're doing, even if it hasn't happened yet. So the business cards for me were created before those businesses existed, and they became something that happened over time because I set my mind and intent towards it. So calligraphy naturally led to business. And so I had my first clients in fifth grade. I started teaching it all through junior high and high school. And it led to other forms of design, including photography and eventually graphic design. So the shorter answer is creativity and visual design has always kind of been my journey, and understanding how it incorporates in a business sense to where I was in the moment. And a lot of the business cards represent me being in the perfect place and time to be part of Warner Brothers Online when online was brand new, to move to the Bay Area when the dot-com boom happened, and the same time my book came out. And then eventually my journey continued to coincide with industry and opportunity and entrepreneurship to become UX design and research.
That is incredible. Your career path is really coincided with the flow of how tech evolved as well. So in some ways, it's it's parallel. And you mentioned the calligraphy was in sixth grade. You started in sixth grade when you were 12 years old.
Yeah, I started it originally in fourth grade, and I just got a book and a pen, and I started lettering, and then I had a client, and I would start my first all-nighters. I'm not advocating for all-nighters, but I had to fit it in somehow, and that generated income, and I just started a freelance career, at that age. And then when I was able to parlay it into both teaching, which I
Hmm.
love, and the book has enabled me, both the Seattle Samurai book and also my first book, Web Redesign Workflow That Works, has enabled me to teach, which I love connecting and seeing, how I can help the students evolve and mentor them. But anyway, yeah, I started pretty young. And so I guess I was 12 when I launched the first business. And I do remember having hand rubbed type where you don't know this, but you had to actually buy type and then rub it down onto a piece of paper. And I did that, and I made a giant business card for myself, and then I brought it to a facility and they reduced it and printed it on that paper. I remember picking out the paper. And so I've always really loved the tactile aspect of design as well. And that's why it's been so rewarding to create a physical book, a tangible book in Seattle Samurai that I can actually hold.
Yeah,
And so I would say, although digital's been a part of it and technology, I keep going back to the hand lettering and the handheld arts. And I always have a lettering pen in my bag and multiple types of pens, and I love paper. And so I think I've kind of gone full circle from starting off with tactile, moving into digital, and now I'm kind of getting back into the print world
that's
again.
amazing. That's a great full circle. And by any chance, were you inspired or influenced by your father's handiwork since he was a comic artist or
I
illustrative?
mean, my dad was a
Hmm.
creative, and he and my sister and myself and my mom, we were always doing projects. So our house was full of piles of
Hmm.
things, and they were always project piles. So my dad, in his spare time, would be drawing things, carving things, and then he and my mom collaborated on 8 books, I believe. There are 8 books. 2 of them are on our family history, and I believe 5 or 6 of them were on kind of storytelling. And my dad would illustrate out these oral histories of the Japanese Americans, and my mom would do the research and collect the stories. And together they produced volumes of small books.
Hmm.
And then he also created kind of a handmade book about the first 25 years of his and my mom's marriage and our lives. And then eventually he put together a book about his 50 years at the medical dental building as a dental technician.
It's
And so
incredible.
those are all books that he created and he illustrated and he put together. We still have boxes and boxes of them in our basement, but they're treasures for
Oh,
sure.
absolutely. And I'm sure that you've also kept your first business card as well.
Yeah, I have all of that stuff. And I think I moved away from my house that I grew up in. And like many people moving back in or coming to help clean out a basement or go through your parents' or your grandparents' things, when I moved back here in 2019, back to Seattle where I grew up, I have been digging through boxes, and that influenced both the book Seattle Samurai, and also I found a lot of treasures from when I was growing up that some you keep, some you maybe decide you need to toss. And so that process of culling and going through your own personal and family history is extraordinary, and it's also overwhelming at
Hmm.
times. So I think people's clutter, for some is junk, and for other people, they're things that you want to save forever. So putting this book together has really helped me sort through and collect things that are important to my family and then put them into a format that they will be always remembered.
Mm, absolutely. And, with your UX, going back to your UX career, you've done lectures around the world, lectures and talks about UX design and research. Do you recall the first time you did your first public lecture? And I guess a three-parter question. It's how did you get called up for it? How did you feel? Like what was going through your mind? And what was the process of preparing for this lecture?
There are Many memories. I will say that the first big lecture that I gave was probably in front of about 5,000 people. And I had been brought up to co-lecture with another group. And the things that I talk about are things that I really believe in. And they're either problems that need to be solved by the industry, and I want to help solve those problems, or it's something that I'm personally attached to or that I believe in. And so the beginning started with understanding workflow and how to incorporate technology. And at that time, there wasn't a word for it, but it became user centered design. How to incorporate that into a typical workflow for a website and eventually web apps and eventually products. So at that time, I had prepared, I had put together the slides, I had stayed up, working all night, and I decided I wanted to do a demo between the first part and the second part. So that meant that I had to cut the presentation in half and save half and save half, and I would pull up one, do the demo, then pull up the second half. Well, when I hit save as and I typed in the new version, it saved over the first half.
Oh, oh
And I
no.
was needing to go up on stage in about 10 minutes, so I didn't have time to run up to my room and get the old backup on a SideQuest disk that we had at the time. So that moment, terror just poured through my whole body, and I was already mic'd, and I had to go up on stage, and I started winging it, and I just started talking. And that proved to me that when you're authentic, when you know your topic, when you believe in what you're doing, and you can connect to the audience, that the best way to do it is just by talking naturally.
Mm. I actually had a chance to watch some, or I would say a couple of your videos. One was from the Android Open in 2011, and the other one was from 2014 called Beyond Usability. And I've noticed in both of those videos, there is you're very straightforward in your talk. Like you mentioned, you're very authentic. You knew what you were talking about. And there were also consistent topics, which again brings back to your authenticity and that you do care for the product that you're talking about. And the consistent topics I've noticed was that you wanted to bridge cultures, continue culture, and tie emotions with technology. And I think you used the Japanese methods. You mentioned the Japanese methods of kansei and chisei, basically designing for emotional connection and creating and promoting stories. And this is kind of a segue in terms of storytelling to Seattle Samurai. And your intention of Seattle Samurai, or many intentions, and one of them, I think, is to honor your father's legacy and also to share the Japanese American history in Seattle, Washington, or in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon as well. Can you share with us briefly how this project started out? How was it conceived?
I want to touch on one thing that you said just because you said it and it's stuck in my
Mm-hmm.
mind. When I did the keynote at Android
Mm-hmm.
Open, it was right after Steve Jobs had
Mm.
died. And so I wanted to honor the fact that the iPhone had revolutionized everything. And we were just getting into mobile at that time. I think it was maybe, I don't remember what year he died, but it feels like it was around 2011 or something. And I didn't normally speak to a tech audience, but I really wanted to highlight the fact that we want to and need to connect with people through experiences and to be able to understand that these aren't just interactions that they're having or transactions that they're having, but they are getting deeply connected to devices. And as I went through my career, I've realized that the addiction is actually a huge problem. And so, if you watch subsequent interviews that I've done or lectures, I do talk about getting to a point where you're helping people live their lives better, not creating addictive, can't put it down dopamine hit technology. And so I try and differentiate between those two things. But I've continued to move towards helping people live better lives, moving into healthy aging, and using technology to age more effectively and safely and independently. And that also has led me into accessibility, which working with the blind communities and also working in healthcare. So what I'm trying to do is move our understanding of what we can do with technology past this dopamine addictive, trying to get people's eyeballs and moving into how can we use this in a flow to enable people to live better lives. So Android Open was like a big piece of that and a starting point. And that's what I meant when I said get beyond usability, is get beyond just this simple, can I use this technology? Can I turn it on and off and understand how to, onboard or sign up effectively, but can I actually integrate it into my life? And at the time of Android Open, South Korea had announced that they were getting rid of all textbooks by the year
Oh.
2025. And there was a report of children clutching their
Mhm.
tablets to bed and having panic attacks and anxiety when the battery would go low. And these are like 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds. And then they started taking teens and they started sending them to camps to detox them from digital addiction. And so I felt, even though it was sort of going against my field in a way, and some people would say, oh, Kelly, you're shooting yourself in the foot. I basically have out loud stated that I don't want to be part of this addiction culture. I've kept my kids out of digital as long as I could and off their phones. I haven't participated in Twitter or X. I have not been on Facebook. I have a very strong stance towards social media. And in a way, it has been the opposite of helping me promote myself and my company. But I have to stand true to what I believe in. And I believe we need to get away from
Mhm.
addiction and into kind of this understanding of using technology for good.
It is so interesting you mentioned this, your beliefs, your perspective, and everything. You have such strong principles, and that is mentioned in Seattle Samurai because your father had very strong principles, and he also showed it in his work, Seattle Tomodachi. And so, my question to you is, can you share with us briefly how this project was conceived and how was it started?
I've always wanted to write a book for my dad about my dad. I had intended to have something done by the time he turned 80 and have it be a gift for our family. He's created so many design artifacts and illustrations and cartoons, and I just knew that I wanted to do something. And at the time, I was going to call it Sam I Am, which is kind of a take on
Yeah.
Dr. Seuss. When he passed away at the very end of 2017, I was going through a personal transition and I was leaving my life in California and moving up to Seattle, trying to. And I realized that my parents' purpose was to educate the next generation, to inspire sort of this understanding of generational storytelling in a way, but it's also culture and values that need to be shared with the next generation. And I think that at that time, I put together a comp and I said, you know what? I think it's really important to take all my dad's cartoons and put them into a book kind of on behalf of what they were doing for the Japanese Cultural Center here in Seattle. And we can do it as a fundraiser. And that sounded like an easy project. And so I put something together in 2019, brought it to an event, and everyone said, yeah, that's a great idea. And I started fundraising and getting money for it. So that's really how it started. One other aspect of it is that at his memorial, right after he passed, at the very last day of 2017, they were still running his comics in the North American Post. But they did say in the Post that, we're sad to say that Sam Goto has passed and we're still running his cartoons. Somebody wrote in from New York, and there are people that read the newspaper across the US, not just Seattle. And he said, I would love it if you put together a book of his cartoons. If you did, I would certainly buy a copy. I am only sad that I cannot get a signed book from Sam Goto. And I wrote him back and I said, my dad actually did kind of write these other books. And I sent him or offered to send him a copy of the medical dental book that my dad had put together. And then he wrote me back 2 weeks later. And this is right before the memorial in March of 2018. He said, You won't believe this, but I was walking on my street in New York and I went to a used bookstore and I went in and on the shelf I spotted a book and I pulled it down and it was your dad's cartoons. And in it, he had signed it.
Oh,
And he said, "So I have a signed copy of your dad's book."
whoa.
And I couldn't believe it. And it was signed to someone, Remlinger, who lived in Seattle, and my dad and mom knew him. And apparently that person had passed. And the kids took the books and probably donated them. And somehow that book made it to New York from Seattle
Wow.
into this guy's hands. So you never
Yeah.
know how things work or why they happen the way they
Mhm.
do. But I thought that was pretty amazing. So those things came together. I already wanted to write a book. This man wrote me and said, "Hey, I would buy a copy." And so that's kind of how it
That's
started.
incredible. That book took a cross-country journey to get to that bookstore in his hands. That is incredible.
I know, I can't believe it. And my dad did not have that many signed copies of that book. I wish I had a signed copy.
It's a rarity for sure. While working on Seattle Samurai, you have learned probably a lot about your father, your parents, probably more about your family's upbringing and their history. And in some parts, Seattle Samurai is like an autobiography memoir of your father, a history book about the Japanese American culture, and and it's like their daily lives from their farming days, cooking Japanese food, and then it talks about the incarceration during World War II and afterwards, and marriage and everything. And this book was definitely done with intention. I want to ask you, did you learn something about yourself through this process?
I learned so much. I'll tell you, I mean, this is a really good question, and I want to think on that because I learned so much about our family
Mhm.
history. I learned so much about my dad's beliefs and sort of why he did what he did. I'll tell you, my original thought was just to put the comics in the book, kind of Peanuts style, Charles Schultz-ish, as an anthology, just a collection of stories, and that I would write some kind of header for each one, like farming, and here's how people farmed, and then cooking, here's how
Yeah.
people cooked, and holidays, here's holidays. And like you mentioned, it became kind of a biography, and it also was Japanese American history here in the States. It became somewhat of a history of Seattle area. And it also, I had to include this strong beliefs that you mentioned earlier that my dad had, just his moral code. And putting those pieces together, I mentioned at the beginning of the book, it's like throwing 1,000 Legos on the floor and trying to figure out how to put them together in a way that makes sense for someone that doesn't know my family, that doesn't know history, and maybe, short attention span these days. How do you try and make it interesting? So, yes, I learned so much in the process. For example, okay, this is just one example. My dad based the book on two key characters. One of them is Shigeru Tomo, and he's this boy, probably 10 years old, who just wants to become American and live the American dream. His dad tells him, if you're educated and you work hard, you're going to make it here in America. And he walks around and looks around and is always wanting to do the right thing. And he's discriminated against and he's shamed at school, but he still keeps trying. And that's really my dad's story. But the other character is Samurai Shigeru, and that's Tomo's alter ego, where he's Japanese and he has this strong moral code, do the right thing and live with honor. And he carries around a wooden sword and he has a sidekick, this dog named Inu. And he's also trying to maintain his Japanese culture and principles while assimilating in America. And so this combination of these two characters is really how my dad grew up. Now, it is based on the real Shigeru, who was born in Seattle in 1891, and he is known to be the first Nisei second generation born in Seattle. And so Shigeru Osawa was interviewed in 1970 as part of an oral history that I found online. And as one does when they're writing a book, you want to fact check. So I found a recording of him being interviewed and I clicked on it. And guess who was interviewing him? My
Oh,
mom.
you're
So I hear her voice, very high pitched, a little bit, really cute. And it's this kind of garbled recording. And he says in it, it's sort of garbled so you can't hear all of it, but he says, "My mom went back to Japan to have the baby boy." And I was like, "What?" And I said, "Wait, this whole premise of the book is about this kid being born in Seattle and the first Japanese, and it's the premise of the character and the premise of the cartoon and the book and everything. And I can't write this book if this is not true." And I asked my mom, and she goes, "Oh, no, no, no. He was born here." But she listens to the recording, and it says the baby boy was born in Japan. So we contact the family. We're still in touch with the Osawa family, and we found the grandsons, Ryan Osawa, and he's living in Japan. And he contacted his aunties, who are the sisters of his great aunts. And they said that the mother had gone back to Japan and she had a boy, but he was born, stillborn, and he passed. So then she came to America and had Shigeru Osawa. And part of the confusion, anyway, it's kind of a long story, but I realized, first of all, okay, yes, everything was true the way that we had been told, but it was kind of confusing. But I realized how integral my mom had been in collecting oral history from the 1970s and traced back the moment where she got hired by the University of Washington, UW Libraries, and she started the oral history collection, which became Densho, and she was on the board for Densho. And I found out that Densho was named at our house because my mom was educating some wives of Japanese businessmen that had come to the States, and they were brainstorming here at our house and came up with the name Densho. And then she brought it to one of her board meetings. And so I just it was really interesting tracing my parents and how they have sort of been at the right place at the right time, and their mission to collect all of these stories before the Issei first generation passed, and then to do something with them to pass these oral histories along, these stories along to the next generation. So that's one big example, maybe a little too long of a story, but just so that I could understand the part that my parents played in this.
that's a huge part. A huge part. In some ways, or maybe this whole thing is like you are literally continuing your parents' work through Seattle Samurai, compiling everything from your father's work of Seattle Tomodachi, but bringing together what your mom has done and kind of reinforcing how important it is to preserve the culture but to also share it because it's part of this country's history. And where we are right now in this country, it's a pretty scary time because they want to erase the history essentially. But doing this, honoring it, preserving it, and sharing it, and you mentioned earlier, you've gone full circle from physical to tech and then back to physical again with Seattle Samurai. From your perspective and background in tech, how can we continue preserving and honoring culture history for future generations in our daily lives?
Your question about preserving digital history is something that I ponder a lot, and I have been part of discussions for National Library in like I, I feel like it was the New York Public Library that I went, and we had a big roundtable discussion about preservation, digital preservation. I do think about all the outdated technologies and the cords and cables and formats that we have, and it kind of reminds me of, I believe it's one of the newer Star Treks that have come out in the last few years where someone found a phone from the 1990s or something, just a phone, and then they were able to use AI to recreate that person's entire life. And I remember thinking, wow, that's so amazing if you can tap into that. So, of course, in science fiction, we have all kinds of references to this. But in the world that I live in, we need to print out photos in order to save them forever. Of course, with AI and all the processing happening and data centers and electricity and all that, data storage and everything has become at risk, or it's just growing and growing and growing as another resource that we're consuming so rapidly. So I do believe that pen and paper are important. And as I go through the boxes in the basement, there's a lot of things that I can't look at because they're cassette tapes, or I have Super 8 film, which actually is tangible. All the digital formats are on beta or different formats that I can't access. I have done my best to get old versions of CD-ROMs and beta tape and VHS tape and um, try and like put these things into a format that we can actually see them again. But it is hard. So paper and pen or carvings, like the rocks that my dad created, his gravestone, he loved rocks and he would find just an everyday rock and then he would split it to see what was inside. And then he would carve those rocks, and those are permanent. And I think that there is some magic, maybe there is some legacy of having something as permanent as a rock. And so those are permanent and those will pass on through generations and generations and generations. So as much as I love digital, I worry about the format disappearing. And I feel like we need to print things out and have tangible versions, things that will stay over time to pass on to the next generation.
My final question for you is, what career advice would you give for people who want to make a career pivot or they are starting to get into UX design and research?
Right now, as you know, there's a lot of change happening really fast in our industry, in every industry, but especially in the tech sector. So AI is coming in pretty quickly. It's supposed to replace everything and make the world faster and better and replace humans. Well, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So I am what I call an AI optimist, in that I understand that it is something that is a new tool that we have to think about how to best utilize it. The book that I wrote, which wasn't a sexy book, it was a primer called the Workflow That Works. I wrote it because I knew that there was a need to understand how to integrate digital into what was previously a paper trail and fax machines and all of that. So, what I think now is that there is a new age that we need to absorb, and we need to understand how both research and design fit into the mix. But understanding people is always going to be important. So, research is always going to be important. After this current heyday of AI comes to maybe a boom and bust moment, there may be a little bubble that's happening. But once we realize what the real uses are from a AI integration or AI workflow perspective and how these tools fit into our lives as designers or researchers, there will be a flattening out of tools and how best to use them. So my advice is to stay the course and to focus on what you know you love, and hopefully connecting with people as part of that process. I really believe in research and the power of human connection. And I believe that we need to remain flexible so that we can jump into different industries or the nonprofit world, like what you're working on. And we need to decide if, and this is something I ask the kids that I teach, or if someone comes in as an intern, is this a job, or is this a career, or is this your purpose? And I think it's really fine to have a job and to get experience and maybe not bring it home and focus on music or something else that you love having a job, just acknowledge the fact that it's a job. Is it a career? Meaning that one thing's going to lead to another thing, to lead to another thing. You have to be slightly more intentful with the types of jobs that you're taking and how they go into a career path. And finding people to do informational interviews for, seeing someone else's career path and saying, oh, that's how they did it. I want to emulate that. That's a career. Finding your purpose and your passion, that's a lifelong thing. So stay the course, but be clear with where you are in that journey and continue to remain an optimist, because I believe that if you are clear with where you are, a job can educate you, a career can drive you forward to a certain point, but really the goal is to find your purpose and your passion. And if you can integrate all three of those things, it's fantastic.
Is there anything that you think your father would say to those who even aspire to either be an illustrator like him who are starting out or to just be in any career path that they want to go to? What do you think he would say to them?
I think my dad actually, he had all kinds of isms. And I think it was his dream to do that cartoon strip, and my mom enabled it to happen. And there's a story there, but basically, he believed in working hard and in getting things done. And the biggest thing that he always said, if you're going to do something, get it done, even if it's not perfect. So he believed in following through with your word. And that was the most important thing. So I think he would say that if you're going to do this as a career, then you need to put your time and effort in and just do a good job and follow through on your word. I don't think he would have career advice for someone as an illustrator except to draw and draw and draw and continue to draw and draw and never stop, doing it, but it may not make money, I don't know. so so he was a very, very much an illustrator and a visualizer and a visual thinker from when he was born. He says that he remembers the day that he was born,
Wow.
and I believe him. And my oldest daughter also says that she remembers the day that she was born, and she's an illustrator also. And so I don't know if there's a tie between having a different perspective on the world and being able to put it down on a two-dimensional plane, but I think there's something there. So I would say that not everyone has that ability, but I do think that if it is something that you want to be moving forward with, that you do it in every way, shape, or fashion that you can.
Kelly, thank you so much for your time, your input. It's been so great talking with you, learning about your process from UX to creating Seattle Samurai. I've learned so much preparing for this talk, but also during this conversation too. And I'd like to say that through this conversation and while I was looking up your work and Seattle Samurai, I think that your personal work and your publication of Seattle Samurai is really like a reflection of what your parents have done too. So thank you so much. It's a true inspiration.
Thanks for having me.